So hopefully everybody was able to complete the bell ringer for today. What is an idea from the Declaration of Independence? And of course, the question that we can have before that is, why do we need it in the first place? And so the textbook, of course, talks about that. And today you had time to work on that a little bit. The Government 2 reading, the textbook assignment, it talks about the colonial situation and why we needed to eventually break from Britain. So we'll cover 3 topics in the notes today in colonial bliss: salutary neglect, colonial examples, and cause for a break. So let's talk about salutary neglect here first. What is that? Well, the second word is the most significant one, and it's a word you are probably familiar with already. When you neglect something, you ignore it. You don't pay attention to it. And that was the intention of Britain in the beginning. They wanted to have salutary neglect. In other words, they wanted to ignore the colonies and let them run themselves. Now, of course, later on, we know that they wanted to raise taxes and that caused a problem. So why would they want to set up this situation in the first place? Well, you have to realize that the colonies were thousands of miles away from Britain. They'd be difficult to administrate directly. It would cost a lot of time and effort and resources. They have to send a lot of people over there. So they wanted to basically let the colonies run themselves. So basically, an important phrase that they want to emphasize underneath salutary neglect was self-government. Self-government. Govern yourselves, take care of your own issues. That way we don't have to worry about what's going on over there. So the colonies were expected to run themselves, and little time or money actually came out of England itself. So they weren't going to put forth that much effort into running the colonies. And in fact, each of the colonies that was started had what was called a colonial charter. They were given their own organizational document, a colonial charter, in order to begin. So each of the colonies had a colonial charter under this system of neglect. One type of course would be a joint stock charter, which businesses would basically get, like the Virginia Company. There would be a proprietary charter, which is spelled Proprietary. That's Proprietary, proprietary, which means it's controlled by a person or a group of people, a family maybe, like William Penn, for instance. And so they could agree to set up this new colony. And of course, there was still the option of being controlled by the crown, having a royal charter. That was also a possibility. So these types of charters, basically, in them, allowed the organizers to set up whatever governing system they thought was necessary. So let's talk about some colonial examples. If we were to go in chronological order, we would start with Virginia. Virginia was actually the first colony. A lot of people, when they're asked, they say Plymouth, but that's actually not true. It was Virginia. Does anybody know the name of the first permanent settlement in the British colonies that would be in Virginia? Starts with a J. Jamestown, yeah. So Jamestown would be the first colony. And if you ever watched Disney's Pocahontas, you're familiar with the background of the story. They're going to find gold and silver and other commodities. There obviously isn't any. And so they eventually have to make an effort to work with locals, although that situation isn't as happy as it turned out in the movie. And then they, of course, have to turn to agriculture because that's the only way they can afford to survive and then eventually make money. The Virginia Company is the one that started the Virginia colony, and it was a joint stock charter. And basically, it was an earlier form of a corporation. A lot of the people that showed up, some of which weren't explorers or survivalists, They were shopkeepers and businessmen who had invested in this company and wanted to see its success. And even though it was a struggle at first, eventually they are able to profit off of it by planting cash crops that they could benefit off of the sale and the profits. They also were the first to set up an actual government, and they would set up what is known as the House of Burgess, which is spelled Burgess. The House of Burgess, Burgess. And so this is a government class, so we should emphasize this part in particular. And something in common with many other governments of this time period is the major concern of the House of Burgess was to protect the landowners. So in order to participate in this system, you had to own land. And so one of the other things that's common in American politics is to be suspicious of new arrivals, people that just immigrated. And so they, of course, wanted to protect the land of people that were already there. And they wanted to have laws that did not favor new people that were arriving. So the House of Burgess. And it eventually became a thriving colony. In the first years of the Republic, Virginia was one of the states with the highest population. So it became quite a success. And quite a few of the earlier presidents in the early Republic were also from Virginia. So a successful colony indeed. The next one that I want to mention is the one that's most common, and the elementary students can name, of course, that would be Massachusetts. Although many cannot spell it. Massachussetts. Massachussetts. And Massachusetts were actually two parts. We kind of simplify it. When people are younger, we just tell them about Plymouth, but actually be two parts. The first part is Plymouth Bay, the Plymouth Bay colony. And what a lot of people don't know is that it was originally supposed to be part of Virginia. The Pilgrims had gotten permission from the Virginia Company, and they were headed to Virginia when they were blown off course. Now, the importance of mentioning them isn't from a historical context, but a governmental one, and that is they basically set up a common precedent in American democracy. Because when they arrived, it had been such a treacherous trip, and then when they got here, the land was not exactly that hospitable. It was cold. There wasn't really a lot of food. They didn't have a lot of resources with them already. Quite a few people had passed away. And so they needed to make a decision whether or not they would stay and try to make a living, or if they would return to England. And so they agreed to take a vote, and they would do whatever the majority said. And so that's known as majority rule. Majority rule. And obviously, a majority did end up voting to stay. And they, of course, they signed all of this in what's known, the document is actually named after the ship. Somebody know what the ship's name is? Yeah?
The Mayflower, and that was the Mayflower Compact, I believe.
Yes, absolutely. So the Mayflower Compact was the name of the document. So even the Pilgrims, which were a type of Puritan who didn't necessarily like differing opinion, allowed, of course, the people to express themselves. And of course, it was only the men and only of a certain age and so on. So obviously restrictions, but they did allow majority vote to take place. The other part of Massachusetts would be the Massachusetts Bay Colony, otherwise known as Boston. Boston. And the reason why we mention Boston is because it was a city that really took off. It became incredibly prosperous. It grew by leaps and bounds. Large amount of residents, businesses. It was a port city, so it was heavily involved in trade. And with all of these issues, goods and services coming in and out, new people arriving all the time, lots of people living close to one another obviously causes problems. And so Boston developed, and for the importance of this class, many locally elected officials. And this is something that we still have today. In fact, we can trace many of our roots of our locally elected offices back to this period of time. So they would elect local tax collectors and sheriffs and magistrates and all kinds of other people to deal with the growing city. And today, at the local level, in Pennsylvania, it would be counties and municipalities, we have many of these very same types of officials. Eventually, obviously, the two would be merged into the colony of Massachusetts, which would become a state. The last one I want to mention is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania would be a proprietary colony started by William Penn. Of course, we know the story. His family owed a lot of, or excuse me, had loaned a lot of money to the royal family, and plus, on top of that, William Penn was a Quaker, a radical group that didn't believe that some people were better than others just because they had a crown on their head. They didn't believe in removing their hats and bowing toward other people. And so young William in particular ended up in jail a few times. And so the crown basically saw an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. We'll pay off the debt to the Penn family and we'll get rid of these Quakers because hopefully a lot of them will move there. And so the crown agreed to sign over the territory that would become known as Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woods as it's known, to the Penn family. And William Penn, being a Quaker, made the colony incredibly generous. It would have a well-established Bill of Rights long before other places in the world, allowing expression, including speech and religion. He'll encourage a generous amount of immigration, even advertising throughout Europe for people to come to the colony. And he's a big advocate of representative democracy. So he also sets up a legislature that has to get reelected every year. So the representatives have to constantly go back to the people and hear them out and basically beg for their jobs. And the Quakers, of course, would have preferred everybody being able to vote, but obviously all these other people arriving had some queer or basically questions about that, whether or not that was acceptable. And so that there were some restrictions. You had to be 21, you had to be a white man, and you had to pay taxes in order to vote. That sounds pretty restrictive, but you have to remember that in most places you had to own land and you had to belong to whatever church was established. And so this was quite a bit more generous than anywhere else at the time. And the last one that I want to mention would be cause for a break. In other words, this situation seems to be working. Everybody sets up their own little system. It's a little bit different in each place that meets the needs of the people. So why do we end up having to declare independence? And the biggest cause of that would be a war. And obviously it's not the war for independence because we're talking about what causes this to happen. What would be the war that would cause us to ask for independence?
The French Indian War.
Yes, the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War was over the territory basically that we're in now, the Ohio River Valley and other parts of the frontier. Believe it or not, this used to be called the West. And so the French and the British both wanted it. And of course, the people already living here, the Native Americans, preferred to keep it the way it was. And being that the French are mostly interested in just hunting and trapping, not setting up plantations, the Native Americans mostly, not all of them, but mostly sided with the French. And we don't want to get too much into the history of it, but obviously the colonists continue to push westward. Military expeditions are sent out, including a young Lieutenant George Washington, who ends up getting in a scuffle with local Frenchmen. And so this eventually gives rise to a larger conflict between Britain and France that's also happening in Europe. There it's called the 7 Years' War. But one of the bigger sticking points is who gets the claim to this territory. Now, once again, we don't want to go too much into the history of this, but in the beginning, Britain was losing thanks to the tactics that the French and the Native Americans used, guerrilla tactics, ambushing, sniping, things like that. The British continued to march in nice, pretty straight lines with bright red coats that you can see from miles away. So it wasn't really the best strategic situation. But eventually, what happened, of course, is government allowed the British to win. And how did they do that? The British Prime Minister, William Pitt, for whom Pittsburgh is named after, ended up taking out a large amount of loans in order to buy an enormous amount of ships and ammunition and artillery and more fancy red uniforms. So that way we could overwhelm the French and the Native Americans. And it ended up working. So taking out all this debt to buy resources ended up working. And you might think, end of story, why didn't everybody just return to happy normal times after that? Yes.
Because they stuck us with the bill.
That's right. Now, their justification for that was the only reason why we needed to borrow this money is to protect you. And on top of that, in England, everyone else there was already highly taxed in comparison. And so the British proposed a series of taxes that the Americans were not pleased with. And it wasn't necessarily that the taxes were high. In fact, even the taxes they proposed would have been some of the lowest in the British system. It was the fact that the colonial charters gave permission only to the colonial governments to tax. And so the founding fathers didn't believe that the British had a right to pass their own taxes. They should have come to the colonial governments and asked for permission to raise the taxes first. But that wasn't the only issue. It wouldn't only be taxes. That would not be the only thing. The other issue would be the Proclamation of 1763. Proclamation of 1763. Now, the British and the French had a Treaty of Paris, but this would be different. The Proclamation of 1763 tried to solve the problems that caused the French and Indian War in the first place. So the first thing that it did was it made peace with the natives. Peace with the natives. And how do you maintain peace with the natives? Well, this would be the second item. Americans were forbidden from moving west. Now that, of course, made the Americans furious because they thought that was the whole point of this war in the first place. So no moving west. And the last item is, how do you make sure that this occurs? You place the Ohio River Valley and other places under military control. So the military would be left in charge. So these issues obviously would boil over, and we'll talk more about these tomorrow, and eventually convince the Americans more and more with each growing year that we no longer saw eye to eye, that America had become too different from the rest of the British system, and that independence was necessary. Like I said, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. For the remainder of the period, in Canvas, in the Government 2 module, there is a second document that we'll take a look at. So the notes, you can go ahead once you're done there to exit out of them. We will use these for the rest of the week, the same document, and you won't turn it in till Friday. So in the meantime, let's go to Go Rockets, back to the home page. So click on G2, Articles of Confederation. Here we can see the first government of the American system, because the Constitution is actually our second government. You hear about other countries, they have 3, 4, 5 governments. And some people might think we have only had one. We've actually had 2. And the first one would be the Articles of Confederation, because once we did separate, we needed a government. The Constitutional Convention wouldn't happen until 1787. So in between 1776 and 1787, we needed a form of government. And so this one, the Articles of Confederation, is what existed. And if you wonder what type of government is it, the clue is in the third word of the title. It's a confederation, like the Confederate States of America. So it was a loose alliance at best. So in this document here, you just put 2 to 3 comments or questions per page on the left. And on the right-hand side, it says to answer the questions under each section. And the second thing to do is, if you were the teacher, highlight what words you might think are vocabulary terms, but only the ones that you're familiar with. So if there's a word you don't know, don't worry about that one. Just highlight the words that you think are the most significant. So obviously in that first section, it just lists states. You don't highlight anything from that, except maybe you might highlight union, for instance, or perpetual, which means forever. So go through and highlight terms that you think are significant and make sure you answer those questions in bold where they appeared. For instance, the Article 2, the question says, what does this article mean? And you would just type the answer to that in your own words right after that. Anything else, if you want to look up words, of course, feel free to do that if you need to. Yes, of course. So do that. And of course, if you get done early, you can go back to the textbook assignment. And then at the end, we'll have the conclusion question in Google Chat.